Sometimes the most important conversations happen with those who can't talk back. For Walt Harris, those conversations were with Mabel, his beloved pig who had been his closest companion since his wife died 5 years ago. Every morning on his quiet Nebraska farm, Walt would share his coffee and worries with Mabel, finding comfort in her gentle presence. When he noticed strange bumps growing on her back, Walt figured they were just part of getting older, something he understood all too well. He'd lost so much already that he couldn't bear the thought of losing her too. But when the traveling vet came for her yearly visit, Dr. Sarah Chen took one look at those bumps, and her face changed completely. What she found wasn't what either of them expected. Could these mysterious growths hold the answer to something scientists thought was gone forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet painted the horizon when Walt Harris stepped onto his front porch, the familiar creak of weathered boards announcing another day. His hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the same one Ellen had given him for their 10th anniversary, the one with the faded blue flowers that matched her eyes. Steam rose from the black coffee, curling in the crisp morning air like memories refusing to settle. At 54, Walt had learned that sunrise was both the hardest and most peaceful part of the day. It was when the silence felt heaviest, when Ellen's absence pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't shift. But it was also when the land spoke clearest, when the gentle sounds of his animals stirring reminded him why he got up each morning. "Morning, Mabel," he called softly, his voice carrying across the yard to where his prize pig had already positioned herself by the fence, waiting for their daily ritual. She was a sight to behold. Nearly 400 pounds of gentle intelligence, with coarse grey hair and eyes that seemed to understand more than any pig had a right to. Walt had raised her from a piglet, and somewhere along the way she'd become less livestock and more family. The farm spread out before him in neat, weathered sections, 40 acres that had been in Ellen's family for 3 generations. The red barn needed paint. The chicken coop's roof sagged in places, and the old John Deere tractor required more prayer than diesel to start each morning. But it was home, and after Ellen's death, it had become his sanctuary from a world that felt too fast, too loud, too eager to move on from the things that mattered. Walt made his way across the yard, his boots leaving prints in the dew-heavy grass. The chickens clucked their morning greetings, and the 3 remaining cattle, Bessie, Dolly, and May, watched him with the patient expectation of creatures who knew their keeper's habits by heart. This was his congregation, his daily reminder that some things in life could be counted on. "How'd you sleep, girl?" he asked Mabel as he reached her pen. She grunted and pressed her snout against the fence, a gesture that never failed to bring a smile to his weathered face. Walt had always been a talker, but after Ellen passed, Mabel had become his primary confidant. She listened without judgment, never offered unwanted advice, and somehow seemed to sense when he needed companionship most. As he scratched behind her ears, Walt's gaze drifted to the farmhouse windows, where a faded wedding photograph still occupied the mantelpiece. Ellen in her simple white dress, him in his father's old suit, both of them grinning like they'd discovered the secret to happiness. Next to it stood another frame, their daughter Sarah at 6 years old, gap-toothed and muddy from helping with the carving. That picture hurt more than the wedding photo because it represented not just what he'd lost with Ellen's death, but what he'd somehow let slip away long before that. Sarah lived in Denver now, worked for some tech company Walt couldn't pronounce the name of. They talked maybe twice a year, awkward conversations filled with careful politeness and unspoken disappointment. She'd wanted him to sell the farm after Ellen died, move closer to the city, start fresh. "Dad, you're isolating yourself," she'd said during their last phone call 3 months ago. "Mom wouldn't want you living like a hermit." But Sarah didn't understand. This farm wasn't just land and buildings, it was where he and Ellen had planned their future, where they'd dreamed of grandchildren running through the pastures, where they'd talked about growing old together. Leaving felt like abandoning not just their dreams, but Ellen herself. The sound of an engine growing louder pulled Walt from his thoughts. A dusty pickup truck was making its way down the gravel drive, and Walt recognized the driver before the vehicle came to a stop. Jim Morrison, no relation to the singer, as he was fond of saying, owned the neighboring spread and had appointed himself Walt's unofficial keeper since Ellen's funeral. "Morning, Walt," Jim called as he climbed out of his truck, his own coffee mug in hand. At 62, Jim had the kind of face that told stories, weathered by sun and wind, marked by years of honest work and the occasional bout of good-natured mischief. He and Ellen had been friends since childhood, and his presence was both a comfort and a gentle reminder of everything Walt was trying not to think about. "Bit early for social calls, isn't it?" Walt replied, though he was grateful for the company. Jim had a way of showing up exactly when solitude began to feel more like isolation. "Coffee's hot, conversation's free, and my own chores can wait," Jim said, settling himself against the fence post. "Besides, wanted to check on that pig of yours. Mabel's been looking a mite peaked lately." Walt glanced at Mabel, who was now rooting contentedly in her feed trough. "She's fine, just getting on in years, same as the rest of us." "Speaking of getting on," Jim said, his tone carefully casual, "Doc Chen called yesterday. Said she'd be making her rounds this week. Might want to have her take a look at Mabel, just to be sure." Dr. Sarah Chen, another Sarah in Walt's life, though this one at least returned his calls, was a traveling veterinarian who serviced the rural farms in their county. She was young, maybe 35, with the kind of energy and optimism that reminded Walt of his daughter at that age. More importantly, she treated animals with a respect that Walt appreciated, never making him feel foolish for caring so deeply about creatures most people saw as commodity. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt," Walt conceded, "though I swear that pig's got more years left in her than my tractor does." Jim chuckled. "That tractor's been on its last legs since Carter was president. Maybe it's time to admit defeat and buy something built after the Reagan administration." "Don't start," Walt warned, but without heat. They'd had this conversation before. Jim understood the attachment to familiar things, even when those things required constant maintenance and frequent prayers. As the two men stood in comfortable silence, watching the farm come alive with the morning light, Walt felt a familiar pang of gratitude mixed with guilt. Jim's friendship had been a lifeline these past 5 years, but Walt knew he'd been less than ideal company. Grief, he'd learned, was a selfish companion. It demanded attention, whispered that nothing else mattered, convinced you that healing was somehow a betrayal of what you'd lost. Ellen would have kicked his stubborn hide for that kind of thinking. She'd been the practical one, the planner, the voice of reason when Walt's emotions got the better of him. "Walter Harris," she used to say when he'd get stuck in his own head. "You can't love something to death by worrying about it." She'd been talking about their struggling crops during a drought year, but the wisdom applied to everything. "You know," Jim said, interrupting Walt's reverie, "Ellen always said this place had good bones, said it just needed the right kind of attention to show its true character." Walt nodded, remembering. Ellen had big dreams for the farm, organic vegetables, maybe some goats, definitely more pigs like Mabel. She'd researched heritage breeds, talked about sustainable farming practices, even started a garden that still produced tomatoes every summer despite Walt's questionable maintenance skills. She had plans, Walt said quietly, always had plans. "Plans don't die with the planner," Jim observed. "Sometimes they just wait for the right moment to grow." Before Walt could respond, Mabel let out a grunt that sounded almost conversational. Both men turned to watch her, and Walt noticed again those small bumps along her back. They'd appeared gradually over the past few weeks, maybe a dozen small, raised spots that felt firm under his touch. He'd mentioned them to Jim in passing, but neither man had thought much about them. Pigs, like people, developed lumps and bumps as they aged. "Those growths still bothering you?" Jim asked, apparently, following Walt's gaze. Not bothering me, exactly. Just notice them is all. Probably nothing. Probably, Jim agreed, but worth having Doc Chen take a look when she comes around. You know how Ellen felt about ignoring small problems until they became big ones. That was true. Ellen had been the type to address issues head-on, whether it was a sick calf, a leaky roof, or a husband who thought he could fix everything himself without help. She'd taught him that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was good stewardship. As Jim finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he paused at his truck door. "Walt, I know you like your solitude, and I respect that. But remember, Ellen married a man who cared deeply about things, not a hermit. Don't let grief turn you into someone she wouldn't recognize." The words stung because they rang true. Walt had been pulling inward since Ellen's death, using the farm's isolation as both shield and excuse. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were declined, and relationships that had once mattered were allowed to fade through neglect. After Jim drove away, Walt found himself really looking at his property for the first time in months. The fence needed mending in places. The vegetable garden Ellen had loved was overgrown with weeds, and the small greenhouse they'd built together sat empty, except for cobwebs and memories. But there was beauty here too. The morning light caught the dew on the pasture grass, making it sparkle like scattered diamonds. The old oak tree Ellen had loved still stood proud and strong, its branches offering shade and sanctuary to anyone who needed it. And Mabel, dear Mabel, continued to provide the kind of unconditional companionship that made getting up each morning possible. As he prepared for the day's chores, Walt made a mental note to clean up the greenhouse before Dr. Chen's visit. Not because he was planning to use it again, he told himself, but because letting it deteriorate further felt like letting Ellen down. Small steps, he reasoned. Ellen had always believed in small steps leading to bigger changes. The sun climbed higher, painting the Nebraska sky in shades of gold and blue that never failed to remind Walt why he'd fallen in love with this place. Whatever those bumps on Mabel's back turned out to be, whatever changes lay ahead, this farm would remain his anchor. Some things, he'd learned, were worth holding on to, even when letting go might seem easier. He just didn't realize yet how much his quiet world was about to change. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived on a Tuesday morning when the October air carried the first hint of winter's approach. Walt watched her compact SUV navigate the gravel drive with practiced ease, the vehicle loaded with the mobile veterinary equipment that made her rounds possible across 3 counties. He'd been expecting her. Jim's call had given him enough warning to clean himself up and brew fresh coffee, though he wasn't sure why he'd bothered with either courtesy. "Morning, Mr. Harris," she called as she stepped out, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her hands already reaching for the worn leather bag that had become her trademark. Dr. Chen had been making these rounds for 5 years. Now, long enough to know which farmers preferred small talk and which ones wanted her to get straight to business. Walt had always appreciated that she seemed to understand he fell into the latter category. "Doc," he replied with a nod, leading her toward Mabel's pen. "Appreciate you coming out. Probably nothing, but Jim thought you should take a look, Doctor." Chen had a way of examining animals that spoke to genuine affection for her work. She didn't just look, she observed, her trained eye taking in everything from posture to breathing patterns before she ever laid hands on a patient. As she approached Mabel's pen, Walt noticed her expression shift from routine professionalism to something more intense. "These bumps Jim mentioned," she said, her voice taking on a different quality. "When did you first notice them?" "Maybe 3 weeks ago. Started small, been growing some, figured it was just old age catching up with her." Walt scratched Mabel behind the ears as Dr. Chen opened the gate. "She's getting on 12 years old. That's pretty good for a pig." Dr. Chen nodded absently, but Walt could see her attention was entirely focused on Mabel now. She ran her hands along the pig's back with careful precision, her fingers exploring each of the dozen or so raised bumps that had been bothering Walt. What he expected to be a quick examination stretched into long minutes of careful palpation and observation. "Mr. Harris, do you have any documentation about Mabel's breeding, papers, lineage information, anything like that?" The question surprised him. "Some, I suppose. Ellen kept better records than I do. Why?" Dr. Chen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the bumps from various angles, her movements quick and purposeful. Then she reached into her bag and withdrew a leather-bound notebook that Walt had seen her use before, though never with such obvious excitement. "I need to ask you some questions about Mabel's history," she said, pen poised over the notebook. "Where did you get her? Do you know anything about her parents or grandparents?" Walt found himself feeling slightly defensive. "Got her from a breeder. Up near Grand Island. Fellow named Peterson. He's passed on now. Why all the questions? Is something wrong with her?" "Nothing's wrong," Dr. Chen said quickly, though her tone suggested something significant was definitely happening. "Mr. Harris, these growths, they're not tumors or cysts like you might expect. They're actually specialized hair follicle formations, and they're displaying characteristics I've only seen in textbooks." She opened her notebook and showed him a detailed sketch of what appeared to be the cross-section of one of Mabel's bumps. The drawing was precise, scientific, and completely meaningless to Walt's untrained eye. "I'm going to need to take some tissue samples," she continued. "Non-invasive ones, just hair and skin cells, and I need to make some phone calls." "Phone? Calls to who?" Dr. Chen looked up from her notebook, and Walt saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. A mixture of professional excitement and barely contained amazement. "Mr. Harris, I think Mabel might be carrying genetic markers from the Mangalitsa breed, the woolly pig. They were thought to be extinct in North America for nearly 70 years. The words meant nothing to Walt, but the intensity in Dr. Chen's voice made it clear they should mean something. "Extinct? What are you talking about?" "The Mangalitsa was a heritage breed from Hungary, brought to the United States in the early 1900s. They were known for their curly, wool-like hair and exceptional hardiness, but industrialization and changes in farming practices led to their decline. The last confirmed Mangalitsa in North America died in the 1950s, or so we thought." She gestured to Mabel's bumps with obvious excitement. "These formations are follicle clusters that produce the characteristic wool of the Mangalitsa. If I'm right, and I need genetic testing to confirm this, Mabel could be carrying dormant genes from that extinct bloodline." Walt stared at his pig, who was contentedly rooting in her feed trough, completely oblivious to the fact that she might be some kind of scientific marvel. "You're saying my pig is special because of some bumps?" "I'm saying your pig might represent the genetic key to restoring a breed that agricultural historians thought was lost forever." Dr. Chen's professional composure was slipping, replaced by the enthusiasm of someone who'd stumbled onto a significant discovery. "Mr. Harris, if these genetic markers are what I think they are, Mabel isn't just special, she's irreplaceable." The word hit Walt like a physical blow. Irreplaceable. It was the same word he'd used to describe Ellen, the same feeling he had about this farm, about the life he'd built and lost and was trying to rebuild. Now this young veterinarian was using it to describe his pig, and something about that felt both wonderful and terrifying. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, though he wasn't entirely sure. He wanted to know the answer. Dr. Chen closed her notebook and looked directly at him. "It means I need to call some colleagues at the university. It means we need to do extensive testing. And it means—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It means a lot of people are going to be very interested in Mabel." The phrase sent a chill down Walt's spine. A lot of people. His quiet farm, his peaceful routine, his carefully maintained solitude, all of it suddenly felt vulnerable. He'd spent 5 years building walls around his grief, creating a small world where he could control the variables, where unexpected changes were limited to weather patterns and equipment failures. "I don't want a lot of people interested in anything," he said firmly. This is a working farm, not some tourist attraction. I understand your concern, Dr. Chen replied, though Walt suspected she didn't. Not really. But Mr. Harris, if I'm right about this, what we're looking at could revolutionize our understanding of heritage breed preservation. Mabel could be the foundation for bringing an entire genetic line back from extinction. Walt looked at Mabel. Again, trying to reconcile the pig he'd raised from a piglet with the scientific marvel Dr. Chen was describing. She looked the same as she had that morning, content, familiar, utterly ordinary, in the way that had made her such a comfort during his darkest days. "How long before you know for sure?" he asked. "I'll need to take samples today, if you'll permit." The genetic analysis will take a few weeks, maybe a month, but Mr. Harris, I have to tell you, I've been studying animal genetics for 15 years, and I've never been more certain about anything. These formations are textbook examples of Mangalitsa characteristics. Dr. Chen began unpacking sampling equipment from her bag, her movements efficient and practiced. But Walt found himself taking a step back, his mind racing with implications. He didn't fully understand. "What happens if you're right?" he asked quietly. She looked up from her equipment, and Walt saw her registering his obvious discomfort for the first time. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's just focus on confirming what we're looking at." But Walt was already thinking about that bridge, about the quiet life he'd built in the shadow of loss, about the daughter who thought he was isolating himself, and the neighbor who worried he was becoming someone Ellen wouldn't recognize. Dr. Chen's excitement was infectious, but it also felt like a threat to everything he'd used to keep himself together. As she prepared to take samples from Mabel's unusual bumps, Walt found himself hoping, perhaps for the first time in years, that someone was wrong about something important, because if Dr. Chen was right, his small, predictable world was about to become very large and very unpredictable indeed. He just wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of change. The samples Dr. Chen collected from Mabel's bumps disappeared into sterile containers with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. But as Walt watched her pack away the specimens that might change everything, he noticed her hands trembling slightly, a detail that only heightened his growing unease. "The lab I use is in Lincoln," she explained, as she secured the containers in a specialized cooler. "Dr. Martinez there is one of the best genetic analysts in the Midwest. If anyone can confirm what we're looking at, it's him." Walt nodded, though he wasn't sure what response was expected. The whole situation felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Mabel continued to root contentedly in her pen, blissfully unaware that she might be the key to resurrecting an extinct bloodline. "How long before we hear something?" he asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Genetic analysis isn't something you can rush." Dr. Chen paused, studying Walt's face with the same careful attention she'd given Mabel's unusual growths. "Mr. Harris, I want you to know that whatever comes of this, I'll make sure your wishes are respected. This is your farm, your pig, your decision about how to proceed." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. They implied there would be decisions to make, procedures to follow, complications Walt hadn't even begun to consider. He'd spent 5 years simplifying his life, reducing it to manageable routines and predictable challenges. Now this young veterinarian was suggesting that simplicity might be coming to an end. After Dr. Chen left, Walt found himself unable to settle into his normal afternoon routine. Instead, he stood by Mabel's pen, studying her with new eyes. The bumps that had seemed like minor inconveniences that morning now felt loaded with significance he didn't understand. Each raised area along her back represented potential for what he wasn't entirely sure, but potential nonetheless. "What have you gotten us into, girl?" he murmured, scratching behind her ears. Mabel grunted in response, pressing her substantial weight against the fence in a gesture of affection that had become their daily ritual. The sound of another vehicle on the gravel drive interrupted his contemplation. Walt looked up to see Jim's pickup truck approaching, earlier than usual for his neighbor's typical evening check-in. Something about the urgency of Jim's driving suggested this wasn't a social call. "Walt!" Jim called as he climbed out of the truck, his expression more animated than Walt had seen in months. "Just ran into Doc Chen at the feed store. She said you might have some news about Mabel." Word traveled fast in rural communities. Walt reflected. Dr. Chen's excitement had apparently been difficult to contain, even in the brief time since she'd left his farm. The thought of his business becoming the subject of local speculation made his stomach tighten. "She thinks Mabel might have some unusual genetics," Walt said carefully. "Nothing confirmed yet." "Unusual how?" Jim pressed, his farmer's instincts detecting something significant in Walt's evasive tone. Walt found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining concepts he didn't fully understand to someone whose opinion he valued. "Something about heritage breeds, genes from pigs that were supposed to be extinct." Jim's eyebrows rose. "Extinct? What kind of extinct are we talking about?" "Mangalitsa," she called it. "Hungarian breed, supposedly died out in America 70 years ago." Walt felt foolish repeating Dr. Chen's technical explanations, like a child reciting lessons he'd memorized without comprehending. But Jim's reaction was immediate and unexpected. "Mangalitsa? Walt, do you have any idea what that could mean?" Dr. Chen seemed to think it was important. "Important?" Jim laughed, though not with humor. "Walt, my grandfather used to tell stories about Mangalitsa pigs, called them the woolly pigs because of their curly hair. Said they were the finest eating pork he'd ever tasted, and tough as nails in winter weather." This was news to Walt. Jim's family had been farming in Nebraska even longer than Ellen's, and his grandfather's stories carried the weight of lived experience rather than academic theory. "You think there's something to what Dr. Chen is saying?" "I think," Jim said slowly, "that if Mabel really carries those genes, you're sitting on something a lot of people would be very interested in. Heritage breed preservation is big business these days. Restaurants pay premium prices for authentic genetic lines. Breeders travel across the country for quality stock." The word business hit Walt like a cold wind. He'd been thinking about Dr. Chen's discovery in terms of scientific curiosity, but Jim was introducing economic realities Walt hadn't considered. Money changed everything, brought complications and pressures that had nothing to do with genetic preservation or agricultural history. "I'm not looking to get into any business," Walt said firmly. "This is a working farm, not some commercial operation." "I know that," Jim replied. "But Walt, sometimes opportunities find us whether we're looking for them or not. Question is, what do you do when they show up?" It was a fair question, and one Walt wasn't prepared to answer. He'd been content with the modest income his small farm generated, supplemented by Ellen's life insurance and his own careful financial management. But content and thriving were different things, and Walt was honest enough to admit his operation had been more about survival than success. The two men stood in comfortable silence, watching Mabel go about her afternoon routine. To Walt, she looked exactly as she had that morning, a beloved pet who happened to provide companionship during the loneliest hours of his day. But now, overlaying that familiar image, was the possibility that she represented something far more significant. "Ellen would have known what to do," Walt said quietly. Jim nodded. "She had good instincts about opportunity. Remember when she wanted to expand into organic vegetables? You thought she was crazy, but she'd researched the market, understood the demand." Walt did remember. Ellen had been excited about sustainable farming practices, heritage varieties, the kind of agricultural approaches that honored both tradition and innovation. She'd seen the farm not just as a place to live, but as a living system that could adapt and thrive. "She also had more courage than I do," Walt admitted. "Different kind of courage," Jim corrected. "You've been holding this place together for 5 years on your own. That takes its own kind of strength." As evening settled over the farm, Walt found himself thinking about courage and change, about the difference between holding on and holding back. Ellen had always pushed him toward growth, encouraged him to see possibilities where he saw only in problems. She would have been fascinated by Dr. Chen's discovery, would have peppered the veterinarian with questions about genetic preservation and heritage breeds, but Ellen wasn't here, and Walt was left to navigate this unexpected development. On his own, the thought was both liberating and terrifying. For 5 years, his decisions had been guided by grief and caution, by the desire to preserve what remained rather than risk what might be gained. Now, looking at Mabel in the fading light, Walt wondered if those bumps on her back might be more than just unusual growths. They might be invitations to engagement, to possibility, to the kind of future Ellen had always believed was possible. The question was whether he had the courage to accept such an invitation, or if 5 years of careful isolation had made him too afraid of change to recognize opportunity when it presented itself. The waiting began the next morning, though Walt hadn't anticipated how heavy 2 weeks could feel when stretched thin by uncertainty. He found himself checking on Mabel more frequently than usual, as if her appearance might change overnight to reflect her potential significance. But she remained reassuringly ordinary, eating her meals, wallowing in her favorite mud spot, greeting him with the same gentle grunts that had become the soundtrack to his solitude. 3 days after Dr. Chen's visit, Walt discovered he wasn't the only one waiting for answers. He was repairing a section of fence when he noticed an unfamiliar sedan turning into his drive, moving with the careful precision of someone navigating rural roads for the first time. The woman who emerged looked to be in her 40s, professionally dressed but practical, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested business rather than social calling. "Mr. Harris," she called as she approached, "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Nebraska Agricultural Heritage Foundation. Dr. Chen mentioned you might have a very special animal here." Walt set down his tools, already feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied unexpected visitors. Dr. Chen's still waiting on test results, nothing confirmed yet. "I understand," Jennifer replied, her smile warm but persistent. "But from what she described, this could be incredibly significant for heritage breed preservation efforts. Would it be possible to see the animal in question?" Something in her tone suggested this wasn't really a request. Walt found himself leading her toward Mabel's pen, acutely aware of how his farm must look to someone accustomed to more formal agricultural operations. The equipment was old but functional, the buildings weathered but sturdy, the whole place carrying the patina of decades spent focused on survival rather than impression. "She's beautiful," Jennifer said as they reached Mabel's enclosure. And Walt was surprised to hear genuine appreciation in her voice. "May I?" She gestured toward the gate. Walt nodded, watching as this stranger approached his pig with the same careful respect Dr. Chen had shown. Jennifer examined Mabel's unusual bumps with obvious knowledge, her hands moving with practiced confidence. "Dr. Chen was right to be excited," she said after several minutes. "These follicle formations are textbook examples of Mangalitsa characteristics. If the genetic testing confirms what we're seeing here, this animal could be invaluable to restoration efforts." There was that word again, invaluable. Walt was beginning to understand that when people used such terms about Mabel, they were also making implicit claims about his life, his farm, his future. Each superlative felt like a small invasion of the quiet existence he'd carefully constructed. What exactly would that mean, he asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answer. Jennifer straightened, her expression shifting to something more businesslike. It would mean partnerships with universities, collaboration with international breeding programs, media attention from agricultural journals and heritage breed organizations, potentially significant financial opportunities as well. The list hit Walt like a series of small explosions. Universities meant academics asking questions he couldn't answer. Media attention meant strangers with cameras and notebooks disrupting his routines. Financial opportunities meant people viewing his farm as a resource rather than a refuge. "I'm not looking for any of that," he said quietly. "I understand your hesitation," Jennifer replied, though Walt suspected she understood very little about his situation. "But Mr. Harris, you have to consider the broader implications. If Mabel carries authentic Mangalitsa genetics, she represents hope for an entire bloodline that was thought to be lost forever. That's bigger than any individual preference." Walt felt his jaw tighten. "This pig has been my companion for 12 years. She's not a symbol or a resource or a genetic specimen, she's family." Something in his tone must have registered, because Jennifer's expression softened slightly. "Of course, no one wants to diminish that relationship, but surely you can see that Mabel's significance extends beyond personal attachment." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with assumptions Walt wasn't prepared to accept. He could see it from Jennifer's perspective. Here was a remarkable animal whose genetic heritage could contribute to important conservation work. But all he could see was the potential disruption of the only stable relationship he'd managed to maintain since Ellen's death. After Jennifer left, with assurances that they would stay in touch, and her business card pressed into his reluctant hand, Walt found himself sitting on his front porch as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The encounter had left him feeling exposed, as if his carefully maintained privacy had already been compromised simply by Dr. Chen's discovery. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced another arrival, and Walt looked up to see Dr. Chen herself approaching, her expression concerned. "Mr. Harris, I heard Jennifer Walsh paid you a visit. I want to apologize. I didn't expect word to spread quite so quickly." Walt gestured toward the empty chair beside him, an invitation Ellen had always extended to visitors, but which he'd rarely used since her death. "Seems like your discovery has people pretty excited." Dr. Chen settled into the chair with a sigh. "More excited than I anticipated. I've had calls from 3 universities, 2 heritage breed organizations, and a livestock genetics company in the past 2 days. Everyone wants to know about Mabel." "What did you tell them?" "That we're waiting for test results, and that any decisions about next steps belong to you and you alone." She paused, studying Walt's face. "But I have to ask, how are you feeling about all this attention?" It was the first time anyone had asked Walt that question, and he found himself genuinely considering his answer. "Overwhelmed," he said finally. "This time last week, my biggest worry was whether the tractor would start. Now I've got people talking about partnerships and media attention and genetic preservation. It feels like my life is being planned by strangers." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "I can understand that, but Walt, may I call you Walt? I want you to know that none of this has to happen without your consent. Mabel is your pig, this is your farm, and you have every right to maintain your privacy if that's what you choose. And if the test results confirm what you suspect, then we'll have a conversation about options, not obligations, options. There's a difference." Walt found some comfort in that distinction, though he suspected the pressure to participate in whatever came next would be considerable regardless of his personal preferences. People who used words like invaluable and significant didn't typically accept "no thank you" as a complete answer. As Dr. Chen prepared to leave, she turned back with one final question. "Walt, can I ask what Ellen would have thought about all this?" The question caught him off guard, partly because it was so perceptive, and partly because he'd been wondering the same thing. Ellen had always been fascinated by the farm's history, had spent hours researching heritage varieties and sustainable practices. She would have been intrigued by the genetic mystery, excited by the possibilities for conservation work. She would have wanted to learn everything about it, Walt said slowly. Would have asked 100 questions I'm too scared to think about. "Fear isn't necessarily a bad thing," Dr. Chen replied. "Sometimes it means we understand the magnitude of what we're facing. The question is whether we let it paralyze us or motivate us to be thoughtful about our choices. As her vehicle disappeared down the gravel drive, Walt remained on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Ellen's greenhouse caught the last light, its empty windows reflecting the sky like closed eyes. For the first time in months, Walt found himself wondering what it might look like with plants growing inside again, what it might feel like to have projects that extended beyond simple maintenance. Perhaps Dr. Chen was right about fear and motivation. Perhaps the challenge wasn't avoiding difficult choices, but learning to make them with wisdom rather than anxiety. Mabel's unusual genetics might represent disruption, but they might also represent opportunity if he could find the courage to tell the difference. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, nestled between the electric bill and a seed catalogue in Walt's modest collection of mail. The return address read, Dr. Elena Martinez, Genetic Research Laboratory, University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And Walt's hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope. After 10 days of waiting, the answer to Dr. Chen's hypothesis was finally in his possession. He didn't read it immediately. Instead, Walt carried the unopened letter to the kitchen table, where he and Ellen used to share their morning coffee, where they'd planned their days and discussed their dreams. The weight of the envelope seemed disproportionate to its contents. A few sheets of paper that might change everything or confirm that life would continue unchanged. When he finally unfolded the letter, Walt found himself staring at language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, genetic markers consistent with, significant probability of authentic lineage. The technical terminology swirled together in a way that obscured rather than clarified the findings. But one paragraph stood out. With crystalline clarity, based on our analysis of the provided samples, we can confirm with 94% certainty that the subject animal carries genetic markers consistent with the Mangalitsa breed. These findings suggest a direct lineage connection to breeding stock imported to the United States between 1915 and 1925. This represents the first confirmed presence of these genetic traits in North American livestock since 1952. Walt set the letter down and stared out the kitchen window toward Mabel's pen. There she was, rooting contentedly in the morning sun, officially confirmed as a living link to genetic history most experts thought was permanently severed. The pig he'd raised from a piglet, whose companionship had helped him survive the darkest period of his life, was apparently one of the rarest animals in North America. His phone rang before he'd fully absorbed the implications. Dr. Chen's voice carried an excitement that crackled through the receiver. Walt, did you get the results? Dr. Martinez called me this morning. The findings are incredible. 94% certainty is about as definitive as genetic testing gets. I got the letter, Walt replied, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. Still trying to understand what it all means. It means you were right to trust your instincts about those bumps being something unusual. It means Mabel is confirmed as carrying authentic Mangalitsa genetics. And it means, she paused, as if choosing her words carefully. It means a lot of people are going to be very interested in talking with you. The understatement in her voice suggested she'd already been fielding inquiries. Walt's stomach tightened as he imagined his phone ringing constantly. Strangers arriving unannounced, his carefully maintained solitude evaporating under the weight of scientific and commercial interest. How many people know about this? He asked. Dr. Martinez is required to file his findings with the Agricultural Heritage Database. Jennifer Walsh will be notified officially, and I suspect word will spread quickly through academic and breeding circles. Walt, I think you need to prepare yourself for some attention. After ending the call, Walt found himself walking to Ellen's greenhouse, a journey he'd avoided for months. The structure stood exactly as she'd left it before her final hospitalization, tools arranged with her characteristic precision, empty seed flats stacked neatly on the workbenches. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but underneath, the bones of Ellen's agricultural dreams remained intact. On the workbench, he found a notebook he'd forgotten existed, Ellen's research journal, where she'd recorded her plans for expanding their farming operation. Her careful handwriting filled page after page with notes about heritage vegetables, sustainable practices, and breeding programs for rare livestock breeds. On one page, dated just 3 months before her diagnosis, she'd written extensively about heritage pig breeds, including several paragraphs about the Mangalitsa, curly-haired pigs from Hungary, her notes read. Incredibly hardy, excellent mothers. Superior meat quality, thought to be extinct in America, but genetic material might persist in mixed breeding lines. Worth investigating local bloodlines for hidden traits. Walt stared at the entry, his hands shaking slightly. Ellen had been researching the very thing that Dr. Chen had discovered in Mabel. She'd suspected 5 years ago that genetic treasures might be hiding in plain sight on small farms across the country. Somehow, without knowing it, Walt had been living with exactly the kind of discovery Ellen had been hoping to find. The irony was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Ellen, who would have been fascinated by Mabel's genetics, who would have seen immediately the conservation possibilities and heritage value, had died never knowing that their own pig carried the genes she'd been researching. A knock at the greenhouse door interrupted his thoughts. Through the dusty glass, Walt could see Jim approaching, his expression unusually serious. "Walt, thought I might find you here. Heard from Doc Chen about the test results." Walt opened the door, welcoming the familiar comfort of his neighbors. Presence. Word travels fast. Fastest thing in rural Nebraska after bad weather and good gossip, Jim replied, stepping into the greenhouse and looking around with obvious appreciation. "And haven't been in here since Ellen passed. She had quite the setup." "She had quite the vision," Walt corrected, holding up the research notebook. "Turns out she was investigating heritage pig breeds right before she got sick. Even wrote about Mangalitsa genetics." Jim examined the notebook with the reverence due to a cherished artifact. "She always was ahead of the curve on agricultural trends. Remember how she started composting before anyone else in the county was thinking about sustainable practices? She would have known exactly what to do with this situation," Walt said, gesturing vaguely toward Mabel's pen, visible through the greenhouse windows. "Maybe," Jim replied thoughtfully. "Or maybe she would have been just as uncertain as you are right now. Ellen was smart, but she wasn't superhuman. She would have had the same questions you're wrestling with. How to balance opportunity with privacy. How to honor Mabel's significance without losing control of your own life." The observation was both comforting and challenging. Walt had been idealizing Ellen's decision-making abilities, imagining she would have navigated this situation with confidence and wisdom he lacked. But Jim was right. Ellen had faced uncertainty with the same mixture of excitement and anxiety that characterized most human responses to the unexpected. "The difference," Walt said slowly, "is that Ellen wouldn't have been alone with the decision. She would have had a partner to discuss options with, someone to help her think through the implications." Jim was quiet for a long moment, studying the dusty workbenches and empty seed flats. "Walt, you know you don't have to make these decisions in isolation, right? You've got neighbors who care about you, professionals like Doc Chen who respect your situation, even family who might surprise you with their support if you gave them the chance." The mention of family hit Walt like a gentle reproach. He hadn't spoken to his daughter Sarah since receiving the test results, hadn't even considered that she might have opinions about the situation or insights that could help him navigate the choices ahead. "I don't know how to explain any of this to Sarah," he admitted. "How do you tell your daughter that your pig might be genetically significant? She already thinks I'm too isolated, too focused on the farm. This will probably confirm her worst fears about my judgment. Or," Jim suggested, "it might show her that your instincts about caring for animals led to something remarkable. Sarah's smart, Walt. She might see possibilities you haven't considered." As they left the greenhouse, Walt found himself looking at his farm with new eyes. The test results had transformed Mabel from beloved pet to genetic treasure, but they'd also highlighted questions about legacy and purpose that went far beyond one pig's unusual characteristics. Ellen's research notebook had shown him that his late wife had been searching for exactly the kind of discovery that had literally been growing in their own backyard. The challenge now was figuring out how to honor both Ellen's vision and his own need for stability, how to recognize opportunity without sacrificing the peace he'd worked so hard to achieve. The answers wouldn't come easily, but for the first time since Dr. Chen's initial examination, Walt felt like he might not have to find them entirely on his own. The phone call to his daughter required 3 false starts and 2 cups of coffee before Walt finally dialed her number. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the distracted efficiency of someone juggling multiple priorities in a busy Denver office. "Dad, is everything okay? You usually don't call during work hours." The concern in her voice reminded Walt how rarely he reached out, how their relationship had devolved into carefully scheduled conversations that avoided anything too personal or complicated. But Mabel's confirmed genetics had shifted something. In his perspective, made him realize that isolation wasn't the same as independence. "Everything's fine," he said, then reconsidered. "Actually, everything's complicated. I've got something to tell you that's going to sound strange." "Strange how?" "Dad, you're making me nervous." Walt took a deep breath and launched into an explanation. Of the past 2 weeks, Dr. Chen's discovery, the genetic testing, the confirmed presence of supposedly extinct Mangalitsa traits in Mabel's DNA. As he spoke, he found himself describing not just the scientific findings, but his own confusion about what to do with such unexpected information. Sarah's silence stretched long enough that Walt began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When she finally responded, her voice carried a mixture of amazement and something that might have been excitement. "Dad, are you telling me that your pig, the pig you've been talking to for the past 5 years, is genetically significant enough to interest universities?" "That's what they're saying. Apparently she's carrying genes from a breed that's been extinct in America since the 1950s. "And you're worried about this? Why exactly?" The question caught Walt off guard. He'd expected Sarah to share his concerns about privacy and disruption, to reinforce his instincts toward caution and withdrawal. Instead, she sounded genuinely curious about possibilities he hadn't fully considered. "Because I don't want my life turned upside down by scientists and reporters and heritage breed enthusiasts," he said. "I like my quiet routine. I like being left alone." "Dad," Sarah's voice carried a gentle reproach, "when was the last time your routine brought you any joy? When was the last time you were excited about anything?" The questions hit harder than Walt expected. Joy and excitement had become foreign concepts since Ellen's death, replaced by the more modest goals of survival and maintenance. He'd been so focused on avoiding additional loss that he'd forgotten what it felt like to anticipate gain. "This isn't about joy," he said, though even as he spoke the words, Walt recognized their inadequacy. "This is about preserving what I have left." "What? You have left of what?" "The farm will still be there whether Mabel is famous or not. The animals will still need care, the equipment will still break down, the seasons will still change. But Dad, maybe this could be the beginning of something positive instead of just another thing to worry about." Sarah's perspective forced Walt to consider possibilities he'd been avoiding. What if the attention Mabel's genetics attracted brought opportunities rather than just complications? What if engaging with heritage breed preservation connected him to communities of people who shared Ellen's passion for agricultural conservation? "I found some of your mother's research notes yesterday," he said, changing the subject slightly. "She was investigating heritage pig breeds before she got sick. Even wrote about Mangalitsa genetics specifically." "Really?" Sarah's voice brightened with genuine interest. "That sounds exactly like something Mum would have been fascinated by. She was always looking for ways to make the farm more than just A place to live. She wanted it to contribute to something larger. Walt felt a familiar pang at the mention of Ellen's broader vision. She would have known how to handle this situation, would have seen immediately what the right response should.
Be.
Or maybe, Sarah suggested gently, she would have been just as uncertain as you are, but she wouldn't have tried to figure it out completely on her own. Mom was good at asking for advice, at bringing people together to solve problems. The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Ellen had been naturally collaborative, comfortable with seeking input from experts and incorporating different perspectives into her decision-making. Walt's instinct towards self-reliance had been balanced by Ellen's willingness to engage with communities of knowledge and support. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "I think you should talk to more people who understand both the scientific significance and the practical implications, not just the university researchers or the heritage breed organizations, but maybe other farmers who've dealt with similar situations. Find out what your options really are before you decide anything." It was sound advice, the kind of methodical approach Ellen would have endorsed. But it also required Walt to extend himself beyond his comfort zone, to engage with strangers and trust in processes he didn't fully understand. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Dad, I'd like to come visit, see Mabel for myself, maybe help you think through some of these decisions. I've got vacation time saved up, and it's been too long since I've been home." The offer was both welcome and terrifying. Sarah's last visit had been awkward, filled with unspoken criticism of Walt's increasingly insular lifestyle and gentle suggestions that he consider moving closer to civilization. But perhaps this situation provided a different context for their relationship, a shared project that could bridge the distance grief had created between them. "You don't need to take vacation time for this," Walt said, though he was already mentally calculating how long it had been since anyone had stayed in the farmhouse guest room. "I want to, Dad. This sounds important, and maybe it's time I paid more attention to what's happening in your life, instead of just worrying about it from a distance." After ending the call, Walt found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at Ellen's research notebook and trying to imagine what the next few weeks might bring. Sarah's visit would mark the longest time they'd spent together since Ellen's funeral, but it would also provide an opportunity to share this strange turn of events with someone who'd known Ellen's dreams for the farm. The afternoon mail brought another letter, this one from a heritage breed organization in Iowa. The formal letterhead and official language made Walt's stomach tighten, but the content was surprisingly respectful. Rather than assuming his participation, the letter simply requested permission to include Mabel's genetic confirmation in their registry database and offered resources for farmers dealing with heritage breed preservation questions. It was, Walt realized, exactly the kind of approach Ellen would have appreciated: informative, without being pushy, respectful of individual autonomy while acknowledging broader conservation goals. Perhaps not everyone interested in Mabel's genetics would approach the situation as aggressively as Jennifer Walsh had. As evening settled over the farm, Walt made his way to Mabel's pen for their usual bedtime ritual. She greeted him with her customary grunt of recognition, pressing her substantial frame against the fence in a gesture of affection that never failed to ground him in the present moment. "Well, girl," he said, scratching behind her ears, "looks like we're about to have some company. My daughter's coming to meet the famous pig she's been hearing about all these years." Mabel's response was characteristically non-committal, but something in her calm presence reminded Walt that change didn't have to mean loss. Sometimes it meant growth, connection, the kind of expansion that Ellen had always believed was possible when people approached uncertainty with open hearts and thoughtful minds. For the first time in weeks, Walt found himself looking forward to what might come next, rather than worrying about what might be disrupted. It was, he realized, the beginning of something that might actually resemble hope. Sarah's rental car kicked up a cloud of dust as it turned into the farm's gravel drive, arriving on a crisp Saturday morning when the October air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. Walt had been expecting her since dawn, cleaning the farmhouse with more attention to detail than it had received in months, and preparing the guest room that had sat empty since Ellen's sister visited for the funeral. His daughter emerged from the car looking every inch the successful professional, tailored jeans, expensive boots that had never seen actual farm work, and the kind of confident posture that came from navigating corporate environments. But her smile when she saw Walt approaching was pure warmth, unmarked by the careful distance that had characterized their recent interactions. "Dad," she said, wrapping him in a hug that lasted longer than their usual greetings. "You look good. Better than I expected, actually." Walt found himself returning the embrace with genuine pleasure, realizing how much he'd missed the simple, human contact of family affection. "You look like your mother when she was your age," he replied, meaning it as the highest compliment he could offer. "Come on," Sarah said, linking her arm through his. "I want to meet this famous pig I've been hearing so much about." They walked toward Mabel's pen together, and Walt found himself seeing his farm through Sarah's eyes. The neat arrangement of buildings, the well-maintained fencing, the careful attention to detail that spoke to decades of patient stewardship. It wasn't the most modern operation, but it was clearly loved, and Sarah's appreciative comments suggested she recognized the care behind the aging infrastructure. "There she is," Walt announced as they approached Mabel's enclosure. "The pig that's causing all the excitement." Mabel looked up from her morning route around the feeding area, her intelligent eyes taking in the newcomer with typical porcine curiosity. Sarah studied her with obvious fascination, taking in the unusual bumps along her back that had started this entire chain of events. "She's beautiful, Dad, and bigger than I expected." Sarah extended her hand toward the fence, and Mabel approached, with the friendly confidence that had always been her trademark. "Those growths really do look unusual. I can see why Dr. Chen was intrigued." They were still admiring Mabel when the sound of another vehicle announced an unexpected arrival. Walt turned to see Dr. Chen's SUV making its way up the drive, followed by a second car he didn't recognize. His stomach tightened with the familiar anxiety that accompanied unscheduled visitors, but Sarah's presence provided a buffer against his instinctive withdrawal. Dr. Chen emerged from her vehicle with her usual purposeful energy, but the man who got out of the second car was a stranger, elderly, perhaps 75, with the kind of weathered appearance that spoke to a lifetime spent outdoors. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose joints carried decades of honest work, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence and what appeared to be barely contained excitement. "Walt," Dr. Chen called as they approached. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. This is Dr. Henrik Novak. He drove down from Minnesota when he heard about our discovery. Dr. Novak, meet Walt Harris and his daughter Sarah." The elderly man extended a gnarled hand with surprising strength. "Mr. Harris, I cannot tell you how excited I am to meet you and see this remarkable animal. Dr. Chen's description of the genetic findings is extraordinary, but I had to see for myself." Walt shook the offered hand, noting the man's slight accent, European, possibly Eastern European. "You're welcome, of course, but I'm not sure what there is to see beyond what Dr. Chen has already documented." Dr. Novak's smile was gentle but intense. "Mr. Harris, what you have here is more significant than perhaps even Dr. Chen realizes. You see, I am not just any agricultural researcher. My family bred Mangalitsa pigs in Hungary for 6 generations before the war scattered us across the world." The revelation hit Walt like a physical blow. This wasn't just another academic interested in rare genetics. This was someone with a personal, historical connection to the breed that Mabel represented. "My grandfather, Istvan Novak, brought the last breeding pair of pure Mangalitsa pigs to America in 1923. Dr. Novak continued, his voice carrying the weight of family history. When I heard about your pig's confirmed genetics, I had to wonder if there might be a direct connection to our family's bloodline. Sarah stepped closer to Walt, her presence steadying as this new information transformed their understanding of Mabel's significance. Are you saying there's a possibility that Mabel is descended from your family's pigs? More than a possibility, Dr. Novak replied, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a leather portfolio that looked decades old. I brought documentation of our breeding records, photographs of our original stock, and most importantly, he paused dramatically, DNA samples from the last confirmed Mangalitsa breeding pair in North America. Walt felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The situation had just escalated from interesting scientific curiosity to something approaching historical revelation. If Dr. Novak was right, Mabel wasn't just carrying rare genetics, she was a direct descendant of specific animals with documented history and verified lineage. Dr. Chen was practically vibrating with excitement. Dr. Novak, if we can confirm a genetic match, this changes everything. We're not just looking at heritage breed preservation, we're looking at the resurrection of a specific family line that's been thought extinct for 70 years. Exactly, Dr. Novak said, opening his portfolio to reveal yellowed photographs of pigs that looked remarkably similar to Mabel. The curly hair, the intelligent expression, even the body conformation were nearly identical. These photographs were taken at my grandfather's farm in 1925. The male was named Hercules, the female was Greta. If your Mabel is descended from their offspring, she represents an unbroken genetic line stretching back to the finest breeding stock in pre-war Hungary. Walt stared at the photographs, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. The pig he'd raised as a companion animal who'd provided comfort during his darkest hours was potentially the living embodiment of agricultural history that reached across continents and decades. What would this mean, practically speaking? Sarah asked, her business background apparently kicking in to address the operational questions Walt was too overwhelmed to formulate. Dr. Novak's expression grew serious. It would mean your father possesses something invaluable to agricultural conservation efforts worldwide. There are breeding programs in Hungary, Austria, and Germany that would pay enormous sums for confirmed genetic material from the Novak line. Universities would compete to study her offspring, and heritage breed organizations would consider her a foundational animal for restoration efforts. The word enormous hung in the air like a challenge to everything Walt thought he understood. About his situation, he'd been thinking in terms of scientific interest and conservation value, but Dr. Novak was introducing financial implications that dwarfed anything Walt had considered. How enormous are we talking about? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Dr. Novak glanced at Dr. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. Breeding rights alone could generate six-figure annual income. Sale of offspring to international programs could bring even more. But Mr. Harris, the real value isn't monetary. It's the opportunity to resurrect a genetic line that represents centuries of careful breeding and agricultural tradition. Walt felt simultaneously overwhelmed and oddly betrayed. The quiet discovery that had seemed manageable just days ago had transformed into something with international implications and life-changing financial potential. The farm he'd been struggling to maintain through careful budgeting and modest income suddenly looked like the foundation for wealth he'd never imagined. I need some time to think about this, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of his heart pounding. Dr. Novak nodded with understanding. Of course, this is overwhelming information, but Mr. Harris, please understand, if we can confirm the genetic connection I suspect, Mabel isn't just your pig anymore. She's a living piece of agricultural history that the world thought was lost forever. As the two doctors prepared to leave, with promises to return the following day with equipment for more comprehensive genetic testing, Walt found himself leaning against Mabel's fence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Sarah stood beside him in thoughtful silence before finally speaking. "Dad, I think Mom would have been absolutely fascinated by this. Not just the money, though, that would have solved a lot of problems, but the historical significance. The idea that this farm is connected to agricultural traditions stretching back generations." Walt nodded, though he wasn't sure fascination was what he was feeling. Overwhelmed, certainly. Confused, definitely. But there was something else growing alongside the anxiety, a sense that Ellen's vision for the farm, as more than just a place to survive, might finally be coming true in ways none of them had ever imagined. The question now was whether he had the courage to embrace such an unexpected transformation, or if the magnitude of the opportunity would prove too much for a man who'd spent 5 years learning to find peace in small, manageable routines. The night after Dr. Novak's revelation, Walt found himself unable to sleep. He stood at his bedroom window at 3 in the morning, looking out at the farm that had been his sanctuary for decades, but which now felt transformed into something he barely recognized. The familiar outlines of barn and pasture remained unchanged, but the knowledge of what they might represent, international significance, substantial wealth, historical importance, had altered his entire relationship with the land Ellen's family had worked for generations. Sarah had fallen asleep easily in the guest room, exhausted from her journey and the emotional intensity of the day's revelations. But Walt's mind refused to settle, circling endlessly around questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with each passing hour. How did a man prepare to make decisions that could affect agricultural conservation efforts worldwide? How did someone who'd been content with modest goals suddenly navigate opportunities measured in 6 figures? When dawn finally broke, Walt was already dressed and making coffee when Sarah appeared in the kitchen, her hair tousled, but her expression alert. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair that had been Ellen's usual spot at the breakfast table. "Keep thinking about what Dr. Novak said, about Mabel not being just my pig anymore." Walt handed her a mug of coffee, noting how natural it felt to have someone to share the morning ritual with again. "I've spent 5 years trying to keep my life simple, and now I'm looking at complications I can't even fully understand." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug, studying her father's face with the careful attention she'd inherited from Ellen. "Dad, what is it you're really afraid of? Because I don't think it's just the complexity or even the attention. There's something else bothering you." The question caught Walt off guard with its directness. Sarah had always been perceptive, but 5 years of careful distance had made him forget how clearly she could see through his defenses. "I'm afraid of making the wrong choice," he said finally. "Your mother always knew what to do with opportunities like this. She would have seen immediately how to balance the conservation value with our own needs, how to engage with the research community without losing control of our lives. Without her, I feel like I'm navigating without a compass." "Maybe," Sarah said gently, "but you're not navigating alone. You've got Dr. Chen, who clearly respects your autonomy. You've got Dr. Novak, who seems more interested in historical preservation than exploitation. And you've got me, even if we haven't been as close as we should have been." The acknowledgement of their strained relationship hung in the air between them, a gentle admission that grief had created distance neither of them had intended. Walt found himself wondering how much of his isolation had been necessary healing and how much had been self-imposed exile from the connections that might have helped him process Ellen's death more constructively. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Novak said yesterday, about Mabel being a living piece of agricultural history. Dad, that's exactly the kind of legacy Mom would have wanted this farm to represent. She always talked about being stewards rather than just owners, about contributing to something larger than ourselves." Walt nodded, remembering Ellen's passionate discussions about sustainable agriculture and heritage preservation. She'd seen their small farm as part of a larger network of people working to maintain agricultural diversity and traditional farming wisdom. The irony that Mabel might represent the ultimate expression of those values wasn't lost on him. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, Walt could see not just Dr. Chen's familiar SUV, but also a larger van and Dr. Novak's sedan, forming a small convoy on the gravel drive. His stomach tightened with familiar anxiety, but Sarah's presence at the table provided an anchor against his instinct to retreat. "Looks like the cavalry has arrived," Sarah observed, squeezing Walt's shoulder as she stood. "Ready to find out what we're really dealing with?" The next several hours unfolded with the methodical precision of serious scientific work. Dr. Chen had brought a mobile laboratory unit complete with genetic analysis equipment, while Dr. Novak carried a cooler containing carefully preserved DNA samples from his family's original breeding stock. The comparison testing would take most of the day to complete, but the preliminary indicators were promising enough to generate visible excitement among the research team. Walt found himself relegated to the role of observer as his farm became a temporary research facility. Technicians moved equipment with practiced efficiency. Dr. Chen coordinated sample collection with the focused intensity of someone conducting groundbreaking research, and Dr. Novak provided historical context that transformed each procedure into a step toward resolving a 70-year-old mystery. "The genetic markers we're looking for are very specific," Dr. Chen explained as she prepared tissue samples for analysis. "Dr. Novak's family maintained detailed breeding records, so we know exactly what genetic signatures should be present if Mabel is descended from the Hercules and Greta bloodline." Dr. Novak spread the contents of his leather portfolio across Walt's kitchen table, revealing not just photographs, but also handwritten breeding charts, import documents, and what appeared to be a family tree for pigs that stretched back to Hungary in the 1890s. "My grandfather was obsessive about documentation," he said with obvious pride. "Every breeding, every offspring, every genetic trait was recorded in these ledgers. If your Mabel carries our bloodline, these records will help us trace her exact lineage." Sarah leaned over the documents with genuine fascination, her business background apparently translating well to the systematic approach Dr. Novak's family had taken to breeding management. "This is incredible record-keeping. Most modern companies don't maintain this level of detailed documentation. It was a matter of survival," Dr. Novak replied. "In Hungary, these pigs represented wealth, status, and food security. Families that bred Mangalitsa successfully could weather economic hardships that destroyed other agricultural operations. The genetic purity wasn't just academic interest, it was practical necessity." As the day progressed and the analysis equipment hummed with activity, Walt found himself walking the farm with new awareness of its potential significance. The pastures where Mabel rooted contentedly might soon be recognized as the home of one of the rarest animals in North America. The barn where he'd sheltered his modest collection of livestock might become a destination for agricultural researchers from around the world. The transformation felt both thrilling and terrifying. Ellen had always dreamed of the farm contributing to something meaningful, but Walt wondered if she would have been prepared for the magnitude of what they were potentially facing. By late afternoon, the preliminary results began emerging from the mobile laboratory. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly animated as she reviewed the data, frequently conferring with Dr. Novak in technical language that Walt couldn't follow, but which clearly indicated significant findings. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Dr. Chen called Walt and Sarah to join the research team around the equipment van. "Walt," she said, her voice carrying barely controlled excitement, "the preliminary genetic analysis confirms what Dr. Novak suspected. Mabel carries genetic markers that match the Hercules and Greta bloodline, with 97.3% certainty." She's not just carrying Mangalitsa genetics, she's carrying the specific genetic heritage of the last confirmed breeding pair in North America. The numbers felt abstract, but Dr. Novak's reaction made their significance clear. The elderly man's eyes filled with tears as he reached out to touch Mabel's fence with reverence that bordered on spiritual. 70 years, he whispered. For 70 years we thought this bloodline was extinct. My grandfather's life work, generations of careful breeding, the genetic heritage of our family's contribution to agricultural history, we thought it was all lost forever. Walt found himself deeply moved by Dr. Novak's emotional response, but also increasingly aware that this confirmation would bring pressures and opportunities he wasn't prepared to handle. The interested phone calls and polite inquiries of the past few weeks would now become serious negotiations and substantial financial offers. What happens next? Sarah asked, her practical nature focusing on the operational questions Walt was too overwhelmed to formulate. Dr. Chen and Dr. Novak exchanged glances before Dr. Chen responded. That depends entirely on Walt's wishes. The scientific community will want to study Mabel's genetics extensively. Heritage breed organizations will be interested in breeding programs, and there will likely be significant financial offers from collectors and research institutions. But, Dr. Novak added, his voice carrying the weight of personal understanding, the most important consideration is ensuring that this genetic heritage is preserved and propagated responsibly. Mabel isn't just valuable, she's irreplaceable. Whatever decisions are made about her future must prioritize the long-term survival of her bloodline. As the research team packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Walt stood with Sarah beside Mabel's pen, watching his pig root contentedly in the evening dirt. She looked exactly as she had that morning, calm, familiar, utterly content with her simple routine. But the confirmed genetic analysis had transformed her from beloved pet into something approaching a living national treasure. "Dad," Sarah said, quietly, "I think tomorrow we need to have some serious conversations about what you want to do with this opportunity. Because it is an opportunity, even if it's also overwhelming." Walt nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd ever feel prepared for the kinds of decisions that lay ahead. The farm that had been his refuge was about to become the center of attention from people and institutions around the world. The question was whether he could find a way to honor both Mabel's significance and his own need for peace, whether it was possible to embrace opportunity without sacrificing the simple life that had helped him survive his grief. As night settled over the Nebraska plains, Walt realized that tomorrow would bring choices that would determine not just Mabel's future, but the entire trajectory of his remaining years. Ellen's vision for the farm contributing to something meaningful was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The decision came to Walt in the pre-dawn darkness, crystallizing with the quiet certainty that sometimes accompanies life's most important moments. He'd been lying awake since 3 a.m, wrestling with the implications of Mabel's confirmed genetics, when Ellen's voice seemed to whisper through his memory, "Walter Harris, the biggest risks come from being too afraid to try, not from trying and failing." She'd said those words 15 years ago when they'd been debating whether to expand their vegetable operation, and Walt had been paralyzed by the possibility of losing money they couldn't afford to spare. Ellen had convinced him that careful risks were different from reckless ones, that thoughtful courage was a virtue worth cultivating. The expansion had succeeded beyond their expectations, providing the financial stability that had allowed Walt to survive the lean years following her death. Now, as the first hint of sunrise touched the eastern horizon, Walt found himself facing a choice that dwarfed any agricultural decision they'd ever made together. But Ellen's wisdom about courage and risk felt as relevant as it had that day in their kitchen. And for the first time since Dr. Chen's initial discovery, Walt felt ready to act rather than simply react. Sarah was already in the kitchen when Walt came downstairs, her laptop open on the table, and her expression focused with the kind of concentration that meant she'd been working for hours. "Morning, Dad. I've been doing some research." She gestured to the screen filled with articles about heritage breed preservation, genetic conservation programs, and agricultural tourism. "There are more options for handling this situation than I initially realized." Walt poured coffee and settled into his usual chair, noting how natural it felt to have someone to share his morning routine with again. "I've been thinking too, about what your mother would have wanted, about what feels right for Mabel and the farm. And I think I'm ready to stop being afraid of making the wrong choice. Ellen always said that avoiding decisions was its own kind of decision, usually the worst kind." Walt took a sip of coffee, savoring both the familiar ritual and the unfamiliar sensation of moving toward action rather than away from it. "I want to call Dr. Chen and Dr. Novak. Ask them to come back this morning. I'm ready to discuss next steps." Sarah's smile was radiant with relief and pride. "Dad, I think Mom would be so proud of you right now." The phone call to Dr. Chen resulted in immediate agreement to return to the farm. Dr. Novak was apparently staying in town specifically to await Walt's decision, and both researchers could be there within 2 hours. Walt spent that time walking his property with Sarah, pointing out the improvements Ellen had envisioned, the potential he'd let lie dormant since her death. "You know," Sarah said as they examined the empty greenhouse, "if you do decide to engage with heritage breed preservation, this place could be perfect for educational programs. People would love to learn about genetic conservation in a setting like this." Walt found himself nodding, imagining the greenhouse filled with seedlings again, the farm bustling with purposeful activity, rather than simply maintaining the status quo. "Your mother always wanted this place to teach people something about sustainable agriculture. Maybe this is how that happens." When Dr. Chen and Dr. Novak arrived, Walt met them at Mabel's pen with the kind of calm resolution that comes from finally knowing one's own mind. Mabel greeted the visitors with her usual friendly curiosity, pressing against the fence for the ear scratches that had become her expected tribute from humans. "I've made a decision," Walt said without preamble. "I want to work with you to preserve Mabel's genetics, but I need to do it in a way that honors both her significance and my need to maintain some control over my own life." Dr. Chen and Dr. Novak exchanged glances that suggested they'd been hoping for exactly this response. "What did you have in mind?" Dr. Chen asked. Walt had rehearsed his proposal during his morning walk, but speaking it aloud still felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I want to establish a heritage breed preservation program here on the farm, work with universities and conservation organizations, but keep the operation centered here where Mabel is comfortable and where I can be directly involved in any breeding or research activities." Dr. Novak's face lit up with enthusiasm. A demonstration farm focused specifically on Mangalitsa preservation. "Mr. Harris, that's exactly the kind of approach that honors both the genetic heritage and the practical realities of maintaining healthy breeding populations. There would be substantial financial support available for such a program," Dr. Chen added. "Grants, research partnerships, even revenue from educational programs. You could modernize your facilities, expand your operation, potentially create a model for heritage breed conservation that other farms could replicate." Walt felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the mention of modernization and expansion, but Sarah's supportive presence helped him stay focused on possibilities rather than problems. What would that look like practically? How much disruption are we talking about? "Initially, very little," Dr. Novak replied. "We'd want to start with careful breeding protocols, using artificial insemination to preserve Mabel's genetics, while we identify suitable male genetics from European Mangalitsa populations. The infrastructure improvements could be implemented gradually based on the program's growth and your comfort level. The approach sounded manageable, even appealing. Walt found himself imagining Ellen's excitement about transforming their modest farm into a center for agricultural conservation, about contributing to knowledge that could benefit heritage breed preservation worldwide. "There's one more thing," Walt said, surprising himself with his boldness. "If we do this, I want my daughter involved in the planning and management. Sarah has business experience I lack, and I think her mother would have wanted this to be a family project." Sarah's shocked expression suggested she hadn't expected to be included in the long-term vision. But her immediate nod of agreement indicated the prospect appealed to her. "Sarah," Dr. Chen said, "your business background would be invaluable for managing the administrative and financial aspects of such a program. Heritage breed conservation requires exactly the kind of strategic planning and partnership development that corporate experience provides." As the four of them stood around Mabel's pen, discussing timelines and possibilities, Walt felt something shift in his relationship with the farm Ellen had always envisioned. For the first time since her death, he was looking forward rather than backward, planning growth rather than simply maintaining what remained. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, more than the usual single car or truck that announced visitors to the farm. Walt looked up to see a small convoy heading up the gravel drive, and his stomach tightened with the familiar anxiety that accompanied unexpected attention. The convoy that pulled into Walt's drive consisted of 3 black SUVs and a news van bearing the logo of a regional television station. Walt's heart sank as he recognized the kind of media attention he'd been dreading. But before panic could set in, Sarah stepped closer to his side with quiet solidarity. "Dad," she said calmly, "remember what you just decided. You're not avoiding this situation anymore. You're managing it on your own terms." The first person to emerge from the vehicles was Jennifer Walsh from the Agricultural Heritage Foundation, her expression apologetic but determined. Behind her came a small crowd of people Walt didn't recognize, reporters, photographers, and what appeared to be several individuals in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Mr. Harris," Jennifer called as she approached, "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but word of Dr. Novak's genetic confirmation has spread faster than we anticipated. These gentlemen represent some very serious agricultural investors who are extremely interested in discussing partnership opportunities." One of the suited men stepped forward with the practiced smile of someone who specialized in making deals. "Mr. Harris, I'm Robert Sterling from Midwest Agricultural Ventures. We're prepared to make you a very substantial offer for exclusive breeding rights to your animal. We're talking about life-changing money, enough to retire comfortably and never worry about farm maintenance again." Walt felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied high-pressure situations, but Dr. Novak's presence beside him provided unexpected support. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Novak said with polite firmness, "I think you may have misunderstood the situation. Mr. Harris has just agreed to establish a heritage breed preservation program that will ensure this genetic line is maintained for conservation purposes rather than commercial exploitation." Sterling's expression shifted to something less friendly. "Dr. Novak, with respect, conservation is a luxury that costs money. We're offering Mr. Harris a chance to secure his financial future while ensuring these genetics are preserved through professional breeding programs with proven track records. Professional programs that would remove Mabel from her home and treat her as a commodity rather than the living piece of history she represents," Sarah interjected, her corporate experience apparently providing her with the vocabulary to engage. With Sterling's business approach, Walt found himself caught between multiple conversations happening around him, each representing a different vision for Mabel's future and his own. The reporters were taking notes and photographs. The agricultural investors were discussing financial projections in hushed tones, and Dr. Chen was trying to explain genetic conservation protocols to people who seemed more interested in profit margins than scientific accuracy. In the midst of the chaos, Walt's attention was drawn to Mabel herself, who had approached the fence to investigate the unusual number of visitors. She stood calmly in the center of all this human excitement, utterly unbothered by the discussions about her genetic significance and commercial value. Her serene presence reminded Walt of what was actually at stake, not money or recognition, or even scientific advancement, but the well-being of an animal who had provided him with companionship during the loneliest period of his life. "Excuse me," Walt said, his voice carrying enough authority to quiet the various conversations. "I appreciate everyone's interest in Mabel and what she represents, but I need to make something clear." The crowd turned toward him with the focused attention that indicated they recognized he was about to make a significant statement. "Mabel is not for sale. Her genetics are not for sale. This farm is not for sale." Walt's voice grew stronger with each declaration, fueled by a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "What we are doing here is establishing a conservation program that will preserve these genetics while respecting the animal herself and the land where she's lived her entire life." Sterling's expression suggested he wasn't accustomed to being dismissed so directly. "Mr. Harris, I think you're making a mistake. The offer we're prepared to make would solve all your financial concerns and provide resources for conservation efforts far beyond what any small-scale program could achieve." "Maybe," Walt replied, "but it wouldn't be the right thing to do. My wife always said that doing the right thing and doing the profitable thing weren't always the same, and when they conflicted, the choice was easy." Dr. Novak stepped forward with visible pride. "Mr. Harris, your commitment to conservation over commercialization honors not just Mabel's genetics, but the memory of everyone who worked to preserve these bloodlines across generations. My grandfather would have approved completely." The television reporter, who had been documenting the entire confrontation, approached with her microphone extended. "Mr. Harris, can you tell our viewers what this decision means for the future of heritage breed preservation in Nebraska?" Walt looked around at the assembled crowd, the scientists excited about conservation possibilities, the investors frustrated by his refusal to prioritize profit, his daughter beaming with pride at his principled stand, and Mabel herself contentedly observing the human drama from her familiar pen. "It means," Walt said slowly, "that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose what's right over what's easy, even when you're scared and even when you don't have all the answers. My pig has given me 5 years of companionship when I needed it most. Now I get to give her a chance to contribute to something bigger than both of us, while making sure she stays exactly where she belongs." As the various visitors began to disperse, some disappointed, others energized by the possibility of supporting genuine conservation work, Walt found himself standing beside Mabel's pen with Sarah, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Novak, feeling more grounded in his own convictions than he had since Ellen's death. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Walt was ready to embrace the challenge rather than simply endure it. 6 months later, Walt stood in the doorway of Ellen's greenhouse, watching Sarah transplant heritage tomato seedlings with the same careful attention her mother had always brought to such work. The structure had been restored and expanded as part of the Nebraska Heritage Farm Conservation Program, but it retained the intimate scale that made it feel like Ellen's legacy rather than an institutional facility. The transformation of the farm had been gradual and thoughtful, guided by principles that honored both practical conservation needs and Walt's desire to maintain the peaceful character of the land Ellen had loved. The new breeding facilities were designed to blend seamlessly with existing structures, and the educational programs drew visitors who came to learn rather than gawk, people genuinely interested in heritage breed preservation and sustainable agriculture. "The Brandywine tomatoes are looking promising," Sarah called from across the greenhouse, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd discovered an unexpected passion. "Dr. Martinez thinks we'll have seeds ready for the heirloom seed exchange by fall." Walt smiled, remembering Ellen's excitement about heritage vegetables and her plans to participate in exactly the kind of seed preservation network Sarah was now helping to coordinate. The irony wasn't lost on him that his daughter, who'd once urged him to leave the farm and move closer to civilization, had taken a leave of absence from her Denver job to help establish programs that would keep the farm viable for decades to income. "Your mother would be proud," Walt said, meaning it completely. "She always believed this place could contribute to something important." Through the greenhouse windows, Walt could see the enhanced facilities that now house not just Mabel, but 3 other sows confirmed to carry Mangalitsa genetics. Descendants of Mabel's first successful breeding with genetic material Dr. Novak had helped locate in European conservation programs. The pigs rooted contentedly in spacious enclosures that provided both comfort and opportunities for the natural behaviors that made them such remarkable animals. Mabel herself, now 13 years old and officially recognized as the matriarch of the restored North American Mangalitsa bloodline, had adapted to her elevated status with characteristic grace. She still greeted Walt each morning with the same gentle grunt of recognition, still pressed against the fence for ear scratches, still provided the companionship that had helped him survive his darkest hours. But now, she was also the foundation of a breeding program that had attracted international attention and funding for heritage breed conservation efforts across the Midwest. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew Walt's attention to the familiar sight of Dr. Chen's SUV making its way up the gravel drive. Her weekly visits had become one of the constants in the farm's new routine, providing both veterinary oversight for the breeding program and the kind of scientific expertise that kept the conservation efforts grounded in rigorous methodology. "Morning, Walt," she called as she emerged from her vehicle, her equipment bag in one hand and a folder of what were undoubtedly breeding reports in the other. "How are our mothers-to-be doing this week?" Walt led her toward the breeding facilities, noting with satisfaction how naturally he'd adapted to conversations about genetic diversity, breeding protocols, and conservation genetics. The learning curve had been steep, but engaging with concepts. Ellen had been researching before her death, felt like completing a conversation they'd started together. 2 of the sows are showing signs that suggest successful conception, Walt reported, using terminology that would have been foreign to him a year ago, but now felt as natural as discussing weather patterns or crop conditions. "Dr. Novak thinks we might have our first generation of conservation offspring by spring." Dr. Chen's smile reflected the same quiet satisfaction that characterized everyone involved in the project. The Nebraska Heritage Farm had become more than just a breeding facility. It had evolved into a demonstration site for community-based conservation efforts that balanced scientific rigor with respect for traditional farming values. As they examined the pregnant sows, Walt found himself thinking about legacy and continuity, about the unexpected ways life could honor both past commitments and future possibilities. Ellen's vision for the farm as a place of learning and contribution was being fulfilled, but in ways none of them could have anticipated when she'd first started researching heritage varieties in her greenhouse journals. The afternoon brought a group of agricultural students from the state university, part of the regular educational programming that had become an important component of the farm's conservation mission. Walt had initially been nervous about public speaking, but he discovered that sharing Mabel's story and the farm's transformation came naturally when he focused on the values and relationships that made the work meaningful. "The most important thing to understand," he told the students as they gathered around Mabel's enclosure, is that conservation isn't just about preserving genetics or maintaining breeding programs. It's about respecting the connections between animals, land, and the people who care for them across generations. One of the students raised her hand. Mr. Harris, what would you tell other farmers who might have heritage animals but don't realize their significance? Walt considered the question, thinking about his own journey from dismissing Mabel's unusual bumps as signs of aging to recognizing her as a living link to agricultural history. I'd tell them to pay attention to what makes their animals special, even if it seems small or unimportant. And I'd tell them that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the ones we're looking for. They're the ones that find us when we're ready to recognize their worth. As evening settled over the farm, Walt made his customary walk to check on all the animals before heading inside. The routine was familiar but expanded now, encompassing not just the original livestock that had provided companionship during his years of solitude, but also the heritage breeding program that connected his small Nebraska farm to conservation efforts worldwide. Mabel greeted him at the fence with her usual gentle grunt, pressing her substantial frame against the barrier. For the ear scratches that remained their daily ritual despite all the changes around them. In her calm presence, Walt found the same comfort that had sustained him through grief. But now it was accompanied by something he'd thought he'd lost forever, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The farm Ellen had envisioned as a place of learning and contribution was finally becoming reality. The greenhouse was productive again, the conservation programs were thriving, and Sarah's involvement had created the family partnership Ellen had always hoped their daughter would embrace. Most importantly, Walt had learned that honoring the past didn't require avoiding the future, that preserving what mattered most sometimes meant allowing it to grow in unexpected directions. Standing in the gathering dusk with Mabel's familiar warmth against the fence and the lights of the farmhouse glowing yellow in the distance, Walt felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had finally learned to balance holding on with letting go, who had discovered that the greatest risks sometimes came from being too afraid to embrace the opportunities that life offered when you least expected them.